Hello, and welcome to another episode of Pop Matters. I'm your host, Professor Lincoln Geraghty, and each month we look at popular culture matters and if they matter, from comics to sci-fi and all things fan-based. This month I have joining me Dr. Emma Austin, Senior Lecturer and Course Leader for Film Studies. Hello.
Hello.
Dr. Rebecca Janica, Associate Professor in Horror Media. Hello.
Hello.
And John Caro, Principal Lecturer in the School of Film, Media and Creative Technologies. Hello.
Hello.
In this episode, as we get further into the spooky season, we will be discussing Halloween horror. Now, everyone seems to like a good horror movie. Lights out, jump scares, creepy music, and some of the most iconic villains and monsters in movie history. Horror is clearly big box office, with low-budget Terrifier 3 currently beating The Joker 2 on its release, and Smile 2, now top of the table in ticket sales. But it's not just at the cinema where we can find scary stories. This Halloween, we can stream numerous TV shows like long-running anthology series American Horror Story on Disney+, South Korean high school zombie fest All of Us Are Dead on Netflix, and cult horror icon Chucky on Amazon Prime. But what makes horror so popular, and why some of these all-time great films and TV series so attractive? Let's start by asking our panel. Emma, John, Rebecca, why and what films do you think are the scariest, and what are your favourites? I'll start with Emma.
That is always a massively difficult question to ask a horror fan.
Well, it's true, but I thought I'd test you straight up.
For a kind of an immediate response, really recent horror that has had a really fantastic impact, and I think is one of those slow burners that as more people hear about it, they're going to want to see it, is The Substance.
Oh, excellent film.
Absolutely fantastic example of body horror, real lashings of the problematic male gaze, but also concepts of how the aging female body can be perceived as both invisible and monstrous at the same time.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic.
And Demi Moore's really good in that, I felt.
Demi Moore is absolutely fantastic. And I really love the fact it's so many physical effects as well. I do love lots of buckets and lashings of gore. That really
blood.
makes a great body horror
Yeah,
text.
body parts. No, it's brilliant. Yeah. Becky?
Interesting. As Emma has described, this is a hard thing to kind of settle upon. I have brought the Jack Torrance Shining Funko
true.
Pop, so there's always a place for The Shining in my view. That's very enjoyable, quite divisive. Not
Film,
everyone.
not TV series.
Well, yes. On the whole, yes. Certainly that's a classic. I am a fan of American Horror Story, which you mentioned, so I do enjoy the way that show kind of deals with genre, haunted houses, vampires, all that kind of thing. Very much so. And I'm also very partial to a bit of cosmic horror, so I have enjoyed, for instance, in recent years, Nicolas Cage, always a strong presence. Colour Out of Space has been very enjoyable for me. It may not be to everyone's taste. It's an interesting film, Colour Out of Space, but it really kind of, takes you outside of yourself and makes you think about our place in the universe. Yeah.
Makes us
An
feel
experience.
very small in the big grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The weird.
The weird. Talking of weird, John. Good segue there. Your favourite film or TV show?
Well, I think I'm going to have to go with, because I brought my hat and I got my
Yes.
badge.
Aha.
So I think, and what you were talking about with body horror and physical effects, I think I'm going to have to go for old school and go for The Thing, 1982,
Yep.
John Carpenter's The Thing, just because it just blew me away at the time. The Rob Bottin, I'm never quite sure how to say his name, but the Rob Bottin effects, just those kind of in-camera physical effects, just still kind of,
They hold up.
hold up and still give me little nightmares to this day. The claustrophobia of the setting, they're all trapped in that outpost, aren't they, in the middle of nowhere, all kind of... So it's almost like a work-based comedy as well, isn't it? They're all kind of forced in together. They all really kind of get on each other's nerves, and then they've got this big terrorising monster to deal with.
That is also, just to say, the Lovecraftian kind of
That's
influence.
true.
It also has, as well as the body horror, links to the kind of the cosmic and
it's the cosmic,
what's out there
it's
and
a ship from the beginning.
how are we
isn't it?
related to that. Intriguing.
Without swearing too much, what's the famous line when he sees the head pop off and start walking around?
Oh, you must be blooming well
Yes.
joking.
But I remember...
No, you've got to be joking. You've got to be kidding me.
Effing kidding me.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
there's an academic article with that title in the with that quote in the title. And I thought, I better read this. And that's what made me watch the thing. It's like, you know, this idea of the monstrosity, the alienness of this creature coming down. Yeah. My favourite, just a little history as well, is Jaws. I know some people might not consider that a horror movie. It might be a sort of a thriller or sort of whatever, but I think, you know, the creature effects on that, and we all know the trouble that Spielberg had to get that bloody Bruce the Shark in working order. But it still has those moments of complete suspense. The jump scares, of course, the music, which is sort of fundamental, John Williams.
But then that's what helped it work too, isn't it? Because it's the unseen, isn't it? Because they couldn't get the shark to work.
Show less of the shark. It fulfills two practical things. Too expensive to show him all the time, and it increases suspense. Yeah, and Jaws 4 is probably the most horrific Jaws film, just because it's so bad. But highly recommended for you.
But it did get Michael Caine a lovely new house.
That's true. Yes. He's never seen the film, but he's reaping the benefits still. Well, thanks for that, folks. Some potential hints and tips for people to sort of see this horror. If they're stuck for things to watch, they can follow our advice. In terms of horror fans and where they might go to see the latest global horror, including things like The Substance, it may not just be the cinema, of course. The festival space is an important space for exhibition. Rebecca and I were lucky enough to be invited to attend and participate in the Ramaskrik Horror Film Festival in Uppdal, Norway, an annual event that has been running for around 14 years. Ramaskrik offers horror enthusiasts the opportunity to see both mainstream and independent horror films from all over the world. This festival has featured films from countries including the UK, Ireland, Spain, USA, South Korea, Nepal, Argentina, France, and of course, no surprise, Norway. This year, they also hosted for the first time the Méliès d'Argent film competition for Best European Short in the horror, sci-fi, or fantasy genre. The winner goes on to compete in the gold final next year. As you'll see from the following video, Ramaskrik has also built up a reputation for not only showing great horror films, but also offers fans the chance to immerse themselves in horror. Uppdal is famous for being home to the mythical Norwegian troll, filming location for Troll Hunter, for example, and the surrounding countryside is wild, rugged, and could contain any number of spooks, spectres, or ghosts. What film does that come from? Let's take a little look at what people said about the event.
Good morning, or whatever it is, wherever you are. My name is Christer Andresen. I'm currently at the Ramaskrik Horror Film Festival in Oppdal, Norway.
We are having our 14th annual Horror Film Fest this year. We're a horror festival over 4 days in the mountains of Norway. That's kind of our concept.
I work in film studies and my PhD is in horror films, Norwegian horror films in particular. And if you've seen one or two of those, you'll probably have an inkling that they tend to be very much interested in the wilderness, woods, mountains.
We have sheeps, muskox, trolls,
water,
mountains,
ponds, lakes, rivers, snow, ice, elements of Norwegian horror, basically.
I'm a master's student at NTNU. I'm here at Ramaskrik. You got some questions for me?
Yeah. What movies have brought you or got you excited coming to Ramaskrik this year?
I don't really focus as much about the program. I just know that this is the festival, and I try not to go so much for the movies, because usually in the program maybe they spoil it. So usually I just read a little bit about it and then talk to people, my friends, and they say, oh, we want to go to see this movie, and I say, okay, cool, maybe I go and see that one then. So for me it's I like all different kinds of things, and also for horror I'm a little bit ambivalent. There are parts of horror that I hate, but there are also parts of horror that I like. So I have to go and really try to find out, is this the one I hate, or do I love this? And sometimes I don't know until I'm sitting there. Hopefully I also have earplugs, that helps.
We're having about 30 plus feature films, and we are going to screen a lot of short films.
What's been your favourite film so far you've seen at Ramaskrik?
Oh, I don't know.
Ah.
I think maybe the short films. The collection of short films was really nice. Not all of them was the best, but it's one of those things when you come to a festival like this, it's the one way where you can see movies that you might not get to streaming or on DVD. And this is definitely one of those. I don't think I will ever have a chance to watch these movies ever again. So that might be it if I have to choose like one. Ironically, that's choosing 19, but
Sport for choice.
yeah, exactly.
Brilliant.
This year we are actually also having a competition, the Méliès d'Argent. That's the kind of qualifying round for the best European fantastic genre short film. That's going to have its final in Sitges in 2025.
We're hoping next year to see more of this tentacle thing from the Kraken that you can see around me.
And we have a lot of filmmakers visiting the festivals, both on the feature films and on the short films. And we also have interesting talks and lectures about video nasties and horror on the deep and talks about horror. And so it's a kind of people from all over Norway travel to Oppdal to watch horror films in 4 screens for 4 days.
At Ramaskrik, audiences can experience all sorts of horror, but also all sorts of the fantastic and comedy, let's not forget. And now they're flocking either into or out of a screening. So we're just into day 2 at this point. We've got a long way to go yet.
A real great event there that really exposes people to the best of horror film and what it can offer. And they even got a little bell from Ramaskrik to celebrate. But what do fans get out of travelling to an experience like that? And what is it about the genre that really attracts them? And I'm going to have a little discussion about that and see what our experts here think. And I want to sort of turn to Emma first. Why do you think people like horror? I know it's a big question. What do you think they're getting out of it, apart from just scares and fear?
I think it sort of depends on how you're kind of consuming the horror, what format you're consuming it in. There's an awful lot within cinematic horror of having that shared space, that space to express emotion in the dark, shared with other people. So it's kind of the enjoyment of the expression of fear.
Yeah.
It's kind of a release of tension. That's one of the key theories, that horror allows us to release kind of tensions that we don't really express any other way in society. For me, I see it as an incredibly safe space for people to imagine the worst, which then allows them to kind of figure out the ways they would react, they would respond to those particular areas. There were a couple of psychological studies done during the pandemic looking at fans of science fiction, of horror, of other genres. And the findings were that people who consumed quite a lot of horror texts actually psychologically responded to the pandemic.
Coped better.
Coped better, essentially, yes, because they'd already kind of lived through these fictional scenarios.
Yeah.
So I find that really interesting. I think, of course, it comes down to your own kind of personal taste and what it is you enjoy. So, for example, I'm not a huge fan of slasher films in the main, because I feel they rely on some kind of problematic notions, especially that concept of stalking as well, and kind of real-world issues,
women.
which I find quite problematic. But then on the other hand, people will consider my taste, particularly zombie and body horror, to be quite extreme as well. So it's very much an individual taste.
Yeah. Now, funny you mentioned the sort of pandemic film like Host by Rob Savage, which actually prepares us for living in a pandemic through Zoom, but actually used Zoom quite effectively to communicate horror, didn't it, in that movie?
I think he actually worked on the concept for that film during the pandemic with his friends. So the original concept was a very short film called The Zoom Where It Happened, and it did appear on Twitter for a while, and that's what got the original interest from Shudder as a channel, who then invested much more in the kind of production context for the feature film.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you two have been doing some research and presented it recently at a conference, haven't you, John? And I'd be interested in your take on the sort of different iterations of horror, maybe the adaptation creation process. I know you're interested in comic books, comic book horror, which we've got a lovely selection here. What was your research on, and how does the Creep Show fit into all of this?
Yeah, well, as you say, our paper that we presented was on Creep Show, which actually currently exists on Shudder.
Yes.
It's a television and a horror anthology series on Shudder. But it began, and the kind of thing we looked at is how it's kind of moved for all of these different platforms and iterations. So it started off as a 1982, same year as The Thing.
There you go.
Started off as an anthology movie, and what got people very excited at the time is it involved George Romero, who was known for the zombie movies, Stephen King, who known for his horror novels, and Tom Savini, the makeup guy, talking about physical effects before. So this was this amazing project. If you're a horror fan in the 80s,
It's like,
it was, wow, these three
The big three coming
legends
together.
are coming together. And what did they use? What was the mechanism they kind of settled on to bring them together? Was Creep Show, which itself was a tribute to the EC horror comics, which I know is something that you've researched and studied and lectured on in the past. And what's really interesting then looking at that is there's a film based on a comic that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
And we looked at how different tropes, kind of comic book tropes, things like the page turn and the host in particular, the vault keeper or the crypt keeper. In Creep Show, it's the creep.
Yeah.
And we kind of looked at how the creep, how he changes, or it changes, they change, depending on the format, whether it's on the page, on the screen, on the TV show, on the big screen. And what's interesting is eventually we've gone from a movie based on a non-existent comic to a anthology television series, which now has led to more than 40 years after the film came out, there now actually really is a Creep Show comic.
Right, okay.
Kind of inspired by the success of the Shudder TV show.
So it seems like Shudder is the sort of connective glue here, sort of real sort of a studio production company that supports, I guess, homegrown horror talent.
Yeah. And it's also Greg Nicotero.
Oh, yes.
So the guy who's a big player in the Walking Dead show. It's kind of his baby.
Yeah.
He worked with Tom Savini and people like that back in the day. He was his kind of mentor. So he's kind of one of the big figures behind it.
This was a key feature we identified in the paper. We delivered this kind of what we call the curious circularity. That this kind of goes in this beautiful cycle of production and influence and homage and adaptation. So one of the key figures in the Creep Show film is a young boy who's reading this fictional horror comic right at the beginning. That's played by Joe Hill, who's Stephen King's son. So he's featured in this film. Now, Joe Hill has actually written for the Creep Show TV series, and the Creep Show comic book has had a special issue, which was Wolverton Station, which was Joe Hill's story. So it's all these kind of generations of horror influence and fandom and love being repackaged and kind of represented to a new generation. And it's had this beautiful kind of afterlife for EC horror comics. They were the victim of a mass campaign, a scare campaign against them in the 1950s in America. And essentially EC Horror were put out of the publishing business. They've been reissued various points since then, but because of the popularity of Creep Show, there has now been new issues of EC Horror coming onto the shelves.
Right.
So it's this lovely kind of sense of, if you like, reanimating what was dead and is now very much alive again.
Well, it just shows you, the sort of constant cycle of horror, as you say, repeating. It's not just in cinema. I know we talked about movies a lot, but TV shows, comic books. I know you've done some research on adapting Lovecraft to a graphic novel, and how is that important to the sort of genre and keeping someone like Lovecraft in the public eye?
Yeah, interesting question. I am very sort of engaged by the way in which horror works in different formats. And Emma, you were talking earlier about, what cinema can bring. And I've always been interested in, or I've become increasingly interested in, how horror finds its way into other media formats. So comics do a nice job of, it's a bit of a halfway house between the written word and the more visual experience, movies can be quite literal in the sense that they take what's on the page and try to bring something very graphically and blatantly to life, and sometimes the power of the imagination is what works so effectively. So yeah, so talking about Lovecraft and cosmic horror, the idea of not showing too much is quite powerful. So for me, comics have worked quite nicely in that regard.
Yeah. It's that stuff about not revealing too much. You know, I mentioned Jaws, and you talked about the while we were during the clip, the idea of not showing things is often more effective, maybe because it's cheaper not to show the baddie or the monster, or it's not working. But actually, that adds so much more to our imagination fills in the blanks, doesn't it?
Isn't there a Stephen King? What's his thing about?
Oh,
is
it's
it the
if you
6-foot
know there's a
bug or-
monster behind the door, and if the door is closed, the monster can be any shape or size or format, anything that's totally fearful to you as an individual. And when they open the door and it's an 8-foot monster, you go, oh, I can deal with an 8-foot monster. If it was a 16-foot monster, that would be a problem. So it's the idea that we can fill in the blanks quite a lot, very effectively ourselves.
And again, that's the beauty of horror, isn't it?
Sometimes showing doesn't mean showing the actual monster either. It can be showing the space where the monster might be and kind of leaning into the darkness, the light levels in cinema, or that kind of thing can
What
be quite
lurks in
potent.
the shadows.
So, you know, that's interesting.
The horror is really effective. We mentioned some titles, films that are currently in cinema, like The Substance, some blockbusters from the 70s, The Thing from Carpenter, who's obviously got a name within horror. We talked about Stephen King, Romero. Today we're talking about big horror franchises. You know, we're talking about the sort of Annabelle sort of universe, isn't it? The Conjuring universe, and how the sort of studios are actually sort of putting a lot of time, money and effort into supporting talent to bring horror to the screen. Almost going the Marvel route, but not quite. How do you think, Becky, what do you think the importance of the sort of franchise horror film now today in keeping horror alive and well for people?
I think that's often a big part of the horror experience. At this time of year, we might look for things that are a bit unusual and a bit different. So the one-off text. But often we are looking for the latest instalment in recent years. We've seen the kind of Halloween cycle kind of come to an end, for instance.
17 films of Halloween.
And of course you've talked about Jaws, and there are other examples like that. And sometimes it's kind of fascinating to me that people who aren't necessarily into horror broadly sometimes identify with a particular franchise. You know, they like that world, they like that character, and they might go for slasher, or they might definitely not, or they might like more Wes Craven or whatever it might be. So I mentioned American Horror Story earlier. That was an interesting one.
That's been going on for a while now. Over 10 years? Yeah.
Yeah, so that was an intriguing one because it starts out, instead of your kind of classic TV model of will we get another series, what will happen to the story, that decision to tell a story and then leave it, and then we're in anthology TV territory.
Yeah, same cast, different story.
Yeah, absolutely. But that is a kind of an interesting take on a franchise model that lets you sort of into the world, which increasingly they started to map out a world. Characters would appear in later series, and we started to think of it as the American Horror Story world a little more.
Universe.
But they're still self-contained. And again, people identify with one story and not another, which I find intriguing.
You mentioned Wes Craven. We've got Freddy's knife-fingered glove. How many movies in that sort of series?
Oh, crumbs! I was watching something about this recently. Because they did a remake, didn't they? They did a reboot.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
But I think is there 6 something? There was Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare.
Right.
Oh, and then there was Freddy and
Versus
Jason.
Jason.
Wasn't there?
Crossover. Well, the crossovers of
yeah.
franchises. Yeah.
And then they did a kind of a meta one, didn't they? Where it was sort of set in the real world.
Yes.
And then I don't.
Didn't he appear on a chat show
one.
like at
Yes.
one
There
point?
was a Nightmare on Elm Street TV
Yeah,
series.
which was an anthology television show too. So yeah. So
I suppose on the back of then favourite films, what is your favourite sort of horror bad guy or villain?
Well, I've suddenly thought of one
Go
where
on.
there isn't technically a horror bad guy.
Yeah.
The Final Destination movies.
Oh, true. So who is the bad guy in that?
Which is like
Luck.
Fate or
Yeah.
Health and Safety, the movie. So, and I heard. Did I dream this that they're going to do another one? I hope so.
Really?
I love
Bring it
those
back.
films.
the weird and wonderful ways people can get killed by a toaster in their living room.
Or a pencil balanced on the edge of a table or something. So, yeah.
Well, it sort of goes back to what Emma was saying. The most innocuous, inane thing could be the scariest thing, lurking just on the sort of side or periphery of the shot. Any other favourite bad guys, villains, murderers, psychopaths?
Well, it's interesting when you have the monster that is, not unsympathetic. I mean, Guillermo del Toro kind of often goes into that territory. So, are we afraid of this or afraid for them? Those sorts of ideas. Going back to cosmic horror, again, rather like The Final Destination, there are some figures like Cthulhu, but the idea isn't that they're villainous. The idea that they just don't care about people, and we are but a fly on the,
insignificance. Emma?
I kind of like it when the concept is turned around and the protagonists are all thoroughly unpleasant people. I'm thinking particularly of the series The Fall of the House of Usher.
Yes, yeah.
Where the key female character, who is originally framed as the antagonist, is actually quite even-handed. It is not necessarily a negative personification of fate or death.
Yeah.
But you look at the backstories of all the members of the family and you think, you know what?
They deserve
They
it.
pretty much had that coming to them.
Which also is another pleasurable thing about horror, isn't it?
We get to judge.
We get to judge
We
and
get
pick
to
who we
judge,
want to
yeah.
get killed first. In A Violent Nature, a film just came out recently, does that. It puts us in the sort of eyes or mind of the killer. We follow them stalking around the forest, and it's the pesky young kids that have come to the forest for a camping holiday that sort of bugger around in that, and each one, you think,
I'm looking forward to you getting it.
exactly,
How will you do?
and the murderer is a sympathetic sort of killer. He's got a sympathetic backstory. He just wants to be left in peace, and these pesky college kids that come and cause a ruckus.
Well, and of course the EC horror comics, they were little moral tales,
Yes.
weren't they? Where it was watching someone get their comeuppance, their greed would be punished, or if they had murdered somebody for money, then that someone would come back and get their revenge.
And so that just reminds us that horror is a sort of very didactic sort of genre, sort of, gets us thinking, gets us those big interminable questions about why we're here and, do we deserve to die and all that sort of stuff. It's quite sort of serious, as well as often being schlocky fun and
Well, I just
horrific.
rewatched The House on Haunted Hill you were talking about, and I'd forgotten how it was really spooky, and I still think, Bentnet lady, still I wake up at night, I think I've seen her. But it's also really moving and very philosophical, and it's talking about life and death and love and all of those kind of big serious topics.
Yeah.
So.
And again, so a genre that we often sort of dismiss as being just about cheap thrills actually gets us thinking seriously about some of those bigger questions. Yeah, but let that be a warning to you if you do bugger around. There's someone out there maybe to knock your head off. But well, thanks for that, folks. It's been really interesting to talk about horror, particularly in the run-up to Halloween. If you have any questions that you want to do or talk to us about, drop them in the comments box on YouTube when we're finished. But thanks very much for tuning in. I just want to say thank you to our guests, Emma Austin, Becca Janica, and John Caro. You've been watching Halloween horror on Pop Matters, because Pop matters.